Tuesday was bread day in my grandmother's house. She baked 2 loaves every Tuesday morning. The first loaf was for Tuesday, sliced at lunch, used for sandwiches through Wednesday. The second loaf was for everything else. By Thursday, the second loaf was getting hard. Not moldy, just firm. The crust had set. The interior had dried out enough that it resisted the knife. Most people today would throw it out at this point. My grandmother never threw out a single slice of bread in her life. Because Thursday's hard bread was not a problem. It was an ingredient. I watched her work through the second loaf over the course of a week. Croutons on Thursday, bread pudding on Friday, stuffing on Saturday if there was a chicken. Sunday she made something with the last few slices that I've been trying to recreate for 20 years. 9 things. All of them from one loaf of bread that was 3 to 4 days old. All of them better than anything she could have made with fresh bread. That's the thing nobody tells you about stale bread. It's not lesser bread. It's different bread. Often better bread for the purpose. Why stale bread is the correct ingredient. Before the 9 things, I need to explain something about what happens to bread as it ages, because it changes how you see all of this. Fresh bread has high moisture content. That moisture is what makes it soft and pliable. It's also what makes it unsuitable for many cooked applications. It absorbs liquid too slowly. It doesn't develop a crust reliably. It falls apart under heat. Stale bread has lost most of that moisture. The starch has retrogrades, reorganized into a denser, more crystalline structure. The bread is firm, absorptive, and structurally stable under heat in ways that fresh bread is not. Bread pudding made with fresh bread is a different and inferior dish to bread pudding made with 3-day-old bread. The stale bread absorbs the custard completely and becomes one thing. Fresh bread absorbs partially and stays 2 things. Wet bread and custard. French toast made with stale bread holds together and develops a genuine crust. Fresh bread soaks through and collapses. Stuffing made with fresh bread becomes gummy. Stuffing made with stale bread stays distinct and has texture. Every application on this list is better with bread that is 3 to 5 days old. The 1950s grandmother who never threw out bread wasn't making do. She was using the right ingredient at the right stage of its life. Thing 1. Bread pudding. The foundational leftover bread dish. The one that appears in American cookbooks from the 1800s and that the Depression and post-war generations refined into something that people now order in restaurants for $12. Stale bread torn into rough pieces, not cubed precisely, torn. A custard of eggs, whole milk, sugar, vanilla, cinnamon. The bread soaked in the custard for at least 30 minutes before baking, long enough for the dried-out starch to absorb the liquid completely. Into a buttered baking dish. Into a 350-degree oven for 45 minutes until the custard is set and the top pieces are golden. The chemical transformation that happens here is specific. The retrograde starch in the stale bread acts as a sponge. It absorbs the custard liquid into its crystalline structure rather than letting it sit on the surface. When the pudding bakes, the absorbed custard sets inside each piece of bread, producing a texture that is neither bread nor custard, but something distinct. I've made this dish with fresh bread and with 4-day-old bread side by side. The fresh bread version is wet and slightly gummy. The stale bread version has a texture that holds together on the fork and releases the custard flavor as you bite. They are not the same dish. My grandmother served bread pudding with a spoonful of whatever jam was open. That's it. No sauce, no cream, no elaboration. The pudding was complete without it. Thing 2. French toast. Every American child has had French toast. Very few American children have had French toast made correctly from stale bread. The bread that is 2 to 3 days old, firm enough to handle without tearing when soaked, develops a crust in the skillet that fresh bread cannot. The exterior sets while the interior stays custardy. The contrast between the caramelized outside and the soft inside is what French toast is supposed to be. Bread that is too fresh soaks through too quickly, becomes saturated, and falls apart when you try to lift it from the skillet. The result is egg-flavored soft bread, rather than the crisp-edged, custardy-centered thing that the dish is meant to be. The custard: eggs, whole milk, a pinch of cinnamon and salt, a small amount of vanilla. Not more egg than milk. The ratio matters. More egg produces a rubbery result. The right ratio is 1 egg to a 1/4 cup of milk per slice. Into butter in the skillet, medium heat. 3 minutes per side without touching. The 3 minutes undisturbed is what builds the crust. Here's what I didn't know until I started taking this seriously. Salt in the custard. A small pinch. Not enough to taste, but enough to suppress the sweetness slightly and let the egg flavor come forward. Every recipe I found from the 1950s had salt in the custard. It has largely disappeared from the modern version. The difference is not dramatic, but it is real. Thing 3. Croutons for the week's salads and soups. Not the packaged kind. Not seasoned with a dozen spices and coated in industrial oil. Bread cubed into half-inch pieces. Tossed in the bacon drippings from the crock. A tablespoon, enough to coat lightly. Salt. Into a 375-degree oven on a sheet pan for 15 minutes until golden. That's it. The crouton made from stale bread and bacon drippings has a structural integrity that the packaged crouton doesn't have. It doesn't get immediately soggy when it hits the soup or the dressed salad. It holds for 10 to 15 minutes, long enough to eat through the bowl before they go soft. The fat from the drippings, combined with the dry starch of the stale bread, creates a barrier on the surface of each crouton during the initial minutes in the hot oven. That barrier is what delays the soaking. My grandmother made croutons every week with whatever bread was becoming stale. She stored them in a paper bag, not an airtight container, a paper bag, on the counter. The paper bag allowed the residual moisture to escape. An airtight container would have trapped it and softened the croutons overnight. Paper bag, counter. Up to a week of usable croutons from Thursday's stale bread. Subscribe and leave a like if you've been throwing out stale bread your whole life. The bell means you won't miss what's next. We're 3 things in. Thing 4. Stuffing. Not just for Thanksgiving. The 1950s grandmother made stuffing whenever she roasted a chicken, which was most weeks. Stale bread torn into rough pieces. Sautéed celery and onion in butter. Chicken stock from the mason jar on the second shelf. Sage, thyme, salt, pepper. Mixed together and either stuffed into the cavity of the bird or baked alongside it in a covered dish. The stale bread absorbs the stock and the fat from the aromatics without becoming gummy. It expands as it absorbs. The pieces that are exposed at the top of the dish dry out further in the oven and develop a crust. The pieces underneath stay soft and custardy. There are 2 textures in one dish: crisp top, soft interior. And they happen automatically from the physics of stale bread and covered baking. No technique required beyond assembling the right ingredients. Here's the detail I find most interesting. The stock-to-bread ratio matters more than any spicing. Too little stock, and the stuffing is dry. Too much, and it's dense. The correct ratio, which the 1950s grandmother had calibrated through years of making this dish, was enough stock that the bread was moist through, but not saturated. You could compress a handful and it would hold its shape without releasing liquid. I learned to feel for that. It took about a dozen attempts. No measurement tells you what your hands learn from doing it. Thing 5. Panzanella, bread salad. This arrived in American kitchens through Italian immigrant communities and spread through neighborhoods into the general American table by the post-war years. Stale bread torn into chunks, soaked briefly in water and then squeezed dry, which rehydrates the exterior while keeping the interior firm. Tossed with ripe tomatoes, sliced red onion, fresh basil, olive oil, vinegar, salt. The bread that has been soaked and squeezed becomes a vehicle for the tomato juice and the dressing. It absorbs the liquid from the tomatoes and the vinaigrette and becomes saturated with that flavor. Not with the neutral flavor of the bread itself, but with whatever it's sitting in. This is the principle that makes bread salad work. Stale bread has more capacity to absorb and hold flavor than fresh bread does. The dish was invented specifically because someone had hard bread and ripe tomatoes and understood that together they produced something better than either alone. My grandmother made a version of this every summer when tomatoes came in and the bread was getting hard simultaneously. She didn't call it panzanella. She called it bread salad. The Italian families in her neighborhood called it panzanella. They were making the same dish. Thing 6. Bread soup, ribollita. Another dish that came through immigrant communities and stayed because it was too good not to. Stale bread, a thick slice or two, hard enough to survive being submerged. Into a pot with white beans, leafy greens, tomato, onion, garlic, olive oil, stock, salt. Simmered until the bread dissolves partially into the broth and thickens it. The name ribollita means reboiled. The soup is traditionally made from yesterday's minestrone with bread added and then simmered again. The reheating improves it. The bread that dissolved into the broth overnight thickens the liquid differently than flour or starch does. It gives the soup a specific body that is grainy and substantial. This is one of those dishes where I had to let go of the idea that soup should look like soup. Ribollita looks like it can't decide whether to be soup or porridge. That ambiguity is the point. It's the most filling thing in this list. A bowl of it with a piece of cheese is a complete dinner. I make this in winter now whenever I have bread that has gone beyond crouton appropriate into genuinely hard. The hardest bread makes the best ribollita because it has the most concentrated flavor and the most capacity to absorb. Thing 7. Breadcrumbs, 3 kinds. The 1950s grandmother did not buy breadcrumbs. She made 3 kinds from stale bread and used each for different purposes. First, fresh breadcrumbs. Stale but not hard bread, processed in a meat grinder or crumbled by hand into irregular crumbs. Used for topping casseroles before baking. For coating fried foods that needed a light crust. For stuffing mushrooms. Second, dry breadcrumbs. The same bread dried further in a low oven for 30 minutes until completely desiccated, then crushed fine. Used for binding meatballs and meatloaf, for coating foods that needed a fine, even crust. Third, toasted breadcrumbs in butter. Dry breadcrumbs toasted in a skillet with butter and a pinch of salt until golden. Called gremolata in some traditions, called buttered crumbs in others. Scattered over vegetables, pasta, soup. A garnish that added texture and richness to any dish that needed finishing. 3 products from 1 loaf of bread, each different, each with specific applications. I keep a jar of each in my pantry now. The fresh crumbs in the refrigerator for up to a week. The dry crumbs in a sealed jar on the shelf for a month. The toasted crumbs made to order in 5 minutes from the dry crumbs. I haven't bought breadcrumbs in 18 months. Thing 8. Bread dumplings. Drop dumplings in soup. Not the flour dumplings that go into chicken and dumplings. Bread dumplings, a specific Central European tradition that came to America through German and Austrian immigrant communities, and that the 1950s grandmother who had those neighbors learned and kept. Stale bread cubed small and soaked in warm milk until saturated. Squeezed to remove excess milk. Mixed with an egg, a little flour to bind, salt, parsley if available. Formed into balls the size of a golf ball. Dropped into simmering broth for 15 minutes. The bread dumpling has a texture that flour dumplings don't have. More dense, more substantial, with a slight chewiness from the bread structure that survived the soaking. It holds its shape in the broth better than a flour dumpling and absorbs the broth flavor as it cooks. Served in bone broth with a little parsley, this was a complete meal from bread that would have been discarded and stock that had been in the mason jar on the second shelf. The total cost of this dinner in 1955? Under 10 cents. The total time? 30 minutes. The total ingredients? Bread, stock, egg, milk, flour, parsley. This is the dish I've made most recently from this list. Last month, the bread dumplings and the leftover chicken stock from Sunday's carcass. I brought them to a dinner, and 3 people asked for the recipe. Thing 9. The last slices. Buttered and toasted under the broiler. This is the simplest thing on this list. It requires no recipe and no technique. The last 2 or 3 slices, too hard for sandwiches, too few for any of the above dishes. Spread generously with butter. Under the broiler for 3 minutes until the butter melts and the surface caramelizes. Eaten with soup. Eaten with an egg. Eaten alone as the thing that finishes the loaf before Tuesday's new baking. The broiler does something to butter on stale bread that a toaster doesn't do. The direct overhead heat caramelizes the butter sugars quickly while the bread below stays firm rather than drying further. The result is a piece of toast with a surface that is almost candy-like and an interior that has enough structure to hold up to whatever it's being eaten with. My grandmother called these the good pieces. Not because they were special, because they were the end of the loaf, and the end of the loaf was always finished this way. And it was always, somehow, better than the middle. I think about that every time I get to the last slices now. The good pieces. What I learned watching her work through one loaf. I want to say something about what those 9 things represent beyond the recipes. My grandmother never had a meal planning system. She had no spreadsheet, no app, no grocery delivery. What she had was an understanding of how food moved through time. How bread on Tuesday became croutons on Thursday, became stuffing on Saturday, became the last broiled slices on Sunday night. The food didn't go from fresh to waste. It went from fresh to different again, to its final best use. That trajectory, seeing food as moving through stages, rather than being either fresh or garbage, is the thing I'm trying to recover through this research. Not the specific recipes, though they're worth recovering too. The underlying way of seeing. A loaf of bread is not one thing. It's 9 things, distributed across a week, each one appropriate to the stage the bread has reached. My grandmother knew this without ever having to think about it. I'm still learning to see it. 9 things from one loaf of bread. Bread pudding on Friday. French toast on Saturday morning. Croutons for the week's soups. Stuffing when the chicken was roasted. Bread salad when the tomatoes were ripe. Bread soup on the coldest Tuesdays. 3 kinds of breadcrumbs in jars on the shelf. Bread dumplings in whatever broth was in the mason jar. and the last slices buttered under the broiler, the good pieces. Not one slice thrown away. A family fed across a week from something most people today throw out after 3 days. Tell me in the comments, which of these 9 things did someone in your family make? Not the recipe, the memory, the smell, what you were eating it with, and who was at the table. Like the video if the good pieces made you think of something from your own kitchen. And subscribe if you want to keep going. She fed everyone. Nobody questioned how.